So, thank you to everybody for coming. It's fantastic to see so many people. And I apologise for not speaking in Russian. I will do maybe a little bit one day, but you wouldn't understand if I did right now. I want to say thank you very much, Boris, for agreeing to have this conversation. And I know that you've been doing many conversations in Moscow this time around, so I feel very honoured to be doing the last conversation with you in this session. So what I wanted to do first was just explain to you a little bit about the concept behind the exhibition, because basically what's happened is, as I've been developing this show, a lot of what Boris has been writing and thinking over the years has been influential. So I wanted to, I invited Boris to have a conversation with me because he basically knows everything and I know a lot less. And I thought it would be great to get his insights on some of the terminology and some of the things that have basically been happening in recent history. So the basic premise of the exhibition is that it is kind of set, if you like, in the 1990s. It begins there. And it's working with two generations of artists, those that rose to fame in the 1990s and became well known, and those that came of age. So in other words, they were people who were born in their 70s, and they were just kind of becoming adults and starting to think about their art practice in the 1990s, and so benefited very strongly from the ways in which the artists who were becoming famous were able to present work. So I'm just going to read 3 short paragraphs, and then I'm going to read no more. It's just to give you the basic structure of what the exhibition is about, because it will set the arena, if you like, for the conversation today. But the key premise is that it's the term international and new that we're going to be talking about, the 1990s, and then what any of this means actually for artists, rather than for curators or theoreticians, because it's very important to think about what this kind of terminology means in terms of art practice. So, I'll tell you the names of the artists after I've read you the basic kind of principle, but we won't be talking specifically about all the artists today. So, drawing on 2 generations of artists, those who rose to international attention and those who came of age during the 1990s, the New International is the latest in a series of projects at Garage Museum of Contemporary Art to focus on the decade as a significant cultural turning point around the world. Each artist presented in the exhibition has developed a singular approach to making work that provides a new understanding of what international can mean. With experiences that span divergent geographies, all of their practices resist location through the monocultural association. Fusing activist and aesthetic languages, they favour discourse over polemics, creating works that contribute subtle nuances to topics such as gender, nationalism, class, economics, capital, the media, and institutional critique. Through juxtaposing plural temporalities and perspectives to visually, physically, and psychologically engage their audiences, each artist presents nuanced worldviews that resist simple categorization. While the term international is now frequently used interchangeably with foreign, it also implies an understanding of the self in relation to a larger viewpoint. As opposed to the expanding unilateral nationalism of today, the new, or perhaps last international, slows down the onset of a fully globalized world. In other words, it is a way to describe how individuals share, understand, or experience context-specific situations without universalizing the outcomes. So that gives a kind of basic premise of how I've been thinking about the term international. But one of the most important texts that I was reading when I first started was an interview that Boris, you did with Ilya Kabakov for Parquet in 1992. And this was the first interview that Kabakov did in English, I think.
No?
Okay. Well, yeah, it was the first time it had been published in English, an interview, yes. And what's interesting about this interview is that it basically sets out as a premise the fact that Kabakov's work would have to be understood very differently when it's being presented in the West versus the way that it's understood in Russia. And so Boris, one of the first questions that he asks is, he says, I remember that when you showed your works in Russia, their meaning and humour were immediately grasped by viewers of the most diverse cultural levels. Usually, only one perplexing question would arise. Is this or isn't this art? In the West, it is clear to everyone that this is art, but is the dimension of content, which is so rich in your work, equally clear? And this really struck me, the idea of artists when they're presenting work outside the context in which they first started thinking through the content. When they're presenting work in other situations, what happens? Is it possible for audiences to understand the work? Is it possible for artists to communicate in ways that they were first kind of thinking? And so I wonder, Boris, if you could talk a little bit about how this interview came about and what this kind of the first way of thinking about what it means as a practitioner to be presenting in other places and what your thinking was at that time.
Of course, it came about because I was asked to make this interview, and indeed it was one of the first visits to the West. I don't believe he stayed after this visit. Yeah, so the first visit came from Russia back, and I think for everybody it is clear, it was clear at that time, it still remains clear now, that after a certain period of time, so after 50s, yeah, I would say, beginning with 60s, Western art and art around the world began more and more be based on everyday life, on cultural experience of the countries. As I saw Pollock for the first time at the American exhibition here in Moscow, for the child of 10 years, and for 9 years, I had no difficulties to understand it, I must say. But then, for example, I had to be instructed that Campbell soup is very widespread in America because I never saw Campbell soup before I saw Warhol's imagery. So you have to know something, you have to have some acquaintance with the cultural context, with everyday life experience to understand art after a certain period of time. Of course, Ilya is very much in this tradition. Yeah? His art is not detached from cultural context in which this art emerged, but brings with it all the meanings and connotations that are not very clear for everybody who's not immersed in this context and foreign to this context. That's not only his problem or Soviet problem or Russian problem, it's a problem of many other artists all around the world.
It was interesting though because he, in this interview, he starts to suggest that in Russia, making work was important for as a discursive framework. When he's exhibiting in the West, the form was really important, and that's how he began to make total installations. And you then start to ask him. You say, do you believe art is closed in an intellectual system of art, or does it directly correspond to the world? And I was very interested in the idea of the fact that as the work is presented in other places, the form over the kind of content starts to shift. Do you think that's something that is very particular to the idea of making art in one context and showing it somewhere else, or do you think that was just something of the time?
Well, I think in that particular case, in the case of Kabakov, it's important to remember that he was a non-official artist and not so much involved in the official exhibition business. He actually, mostly, almost exclusively, he has shown his work inside his atelier to the visitors. So he was not included in this, neutral, inhuman exhibition institutions, yeah. And they are all the same all over the world again. Yeah. So, coming to the West, he was for the first time confronted with necessity, possibility and necessity to show his work in a place he does not control. Yeah? And he absolutely hated that. First of all, he absolutely hated the look of Western museums. He hated the look of Western galleries. He hated the work of the curators. He wanted to recreate the situation of control, of total control over the visitor and over the conditions under which he exhibited his work. And his idea of total installation is nothing else as an attempt to reconstruct his experience of inviting people to his atelier and showing them his work under the specific condition of the Western art system.
During the, I mean, you do this interview in 1992, so it's very early in the 90s. But what has just happened is one of the most famous exhibitions of the time, the so-called first global exhibition, Magician de la Terre, where Johnny Beaumartin says that he wants to show 50 artists from the West and 50 from the rest of the world. And he makes this claim that what's important to him is that he wants to make an exhibition that is not governed by cultural diplomacy, and that is done much more about getting to know artists and trying to present artists' work that is not to do with kind of politics and the politics of cultural exchange, but on spirituality and trying to present the different perspectives that artists have in different places around the world.
Accidentally, I was communicating with him in the period of preparation of this exhibition, and that happened precisely because at that time he was director of the Kunsthalle in Bern, and the project before the Magician de la Terre was a project of Kabakov exhibition. It was actually a first Kabakov exhibition in the West. It was in Bern, and Kabakov was not allowed to come. So he asked me to go there and to collaborate with Johnny Beaumartin. So that was the time I had an opportunity also to discuss his plans, with him in a very extensive way. And his idea was, of course, to mobilize this project to relativize modernism, relativize the concept of avant-garde, relativize the modernist canon in a form it was established in the West here in the last decades. And to show that there are different countries, different histories, different attitudes that have nothing to do with Western modernism, and offer an alternative to the Western modernism, undermine the normative character of Western modernism as a kind of neo-colonialist project, if you want. At the same time, the artists from that countries, and critics and intellectuals were mostly offended by this exhibition, and they were offended by this exhibition because they didn't want to be excluded from the canonical Western history. So the reaction was, he looks at us in a neo-colonialist perspective as indigenous population that cannot and will not participate in a modernist and avant-garde history. At the same time, yes, we want to do it, and we've already done it, and it is ignored. So there was a huge misunderstanding. I spoke also to the people who were very much offended by this exhibition, and they understood this exhibition as, how to say, legitimation of an intellectual dominance of the West. So it was not understood as a criticism of that. It was not understood as actually Martin planned it completely honestly, as undermining this pretense, but as enforcing it. Yeah? So it was a huge misunderstanding, and of course a huge scandal. And for me now also retrospectively, it's very difficult to take sides.
It's interesting because, again, just kind of sticking to the early 90s to begin with, actually in 97 there was the first round table or kind of closed door discussion between curators, the first time they'd been brought together. And it was the Rockefeller that brought these people together. And there was a critic called Michael Benson who was invited to attend this conference to basically report on what he'd heard. And when he writes this report, which was published in a magazine later, he basically says that the era of the curator has begun. Because it's almost as if it's a kind of response or retaliation to Magician de la Terre, but also to a few other shows that happened at that time, wherein the curator seems to kind of take control of like how to describe what is going on in the world, trying to describe what is global, what is international, trying to represent a different structure of the world through exhibitions. But what Michael Benson asks in listening to these curators is this actually possible? Is it possible to understand a post, he talks about a post-Cold War, post-colonial, end of the century moment, if we are not fully understanding how artists' works can be presented so that they're not kind of engineered, or they're not kind of put in motion of somebody else's ideas. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit in your experience, because you were in Germany and you were looking very much from the West at the time, but can you talk a little bit about your perspective and your writing, kind of thinking through this problem as well?
First of all, I would say that the role of curator became, of course, a leading one, and in Europe, even faster and more, continental Europe than the Saxon world. So I was already very much informed about Harald Zeeman and all of that. At the same time, one has to realize that at the moment the canonical history, canonical art history became to be attacked and became to dissolve under these attacks from different minorities, from post-colonial discourse, from this and that. Yeah? We are began to be confronted with this proliferation of histories, proliferation of historical narratives, proliferation of subjective interpretations of them, and so on and so on. They, of course, dissolve this canonical history, but they never exchanged it. So every curatorial project is actually like a theater piece. Yeah, it's staged for a time. It's very important that curatorial project, in a sense, as it was understood by Zeeman and all the other innovative curators, so to say, that is a temporal exhibition, an exhibition that has beginning and end. And what has beginning and end actually never changed anything. Yeah? So you have, because the end is already anticipated. So what we are confronted with is the staging of one curatorial project after another. And we have now something like a history of curatorial projects. And we have now also confronted with attempts to reenact curatorial projects, as it was the case with Zeeman, Attitudes Become Form, at the last biennial. So you have this kind of self-historization of curatorial practices. And in the sense, I wouldn't say that these curatorial practices change the history, or change curatorial history. They change art history. They just dissolve it in a certain way and stage this dissolution. I made during this time few but big curatorial projects. One of them was to show socialist realism, for the first time in the West. And my experience was, I think, typical for everybody who acts as a curator. It was interesting experience, but at the end, only documentation remains and get lost among the whole sea of documentation spread around the archives and internet. So my feeling was a mixed feeling, I must say, from my curatorial activities. I felt that they were successful because they attract people to the discuss. At the same time, I felt it's not the same thing for me, at least. I know it's different. As to write a book, because write a book, you have still this, 19th century, 18th century illusion. But illusion is important in life, You have a false illusion of intellectual survival, and false illusion, we know from Nietzsche, is good for life.
Before I talk a little bit about the artists in the show, I've just got one more. This question of what the word international actually means. It's something that I've struggled with because it seems to mean nothing, and yet it's used all the time. There's always the word international put in something in front of something, and as I said in the introduction, it means as much as foreign in many situations, or it can mean kind of understanding the self in relation to something that is bigger. But it has a different beginning because it starts with the first international, second, third international. It then moves into the post-Second World War understanding of international as one world, with the development of the United Nations and the European Union. But this is something, I know you've been thinking about this word and what it actually means for a while. So is there, what is your understanding of international?
I understand international as oppositional to globalization. International is opposed to global. Globalization is a globalization of capitalism. Globalization of capitalism is globalization of the economy. Economy begins to flow, economy begins to circulate. But people do not circulate, and cultures do not circulate, and politics do not circulate. So a globalized world is a world of dictatorship of capital, simply because there is a dissymmetry between degree of economical globalization and degree of political globalization. We have global financial flows and local states that all are weak in relationship to the flows simply because they are local. And the same can be said about art institutions, that in one way or another try to substitute this kind of lack of international political order. Marx saw that very clearly at the beginning of the globalization process, and so this worker organization, this First International, was actually an attempt to create alternative globalization or alternative political internalization. And if you look now at the curatorial projects of the last decades, they are obviously operate in this niche, in this lack, in the space of absence of international political order, because of course all the institutions, also art institutions, like museums, academies, are national after all. So international curatorial projects, I told you, I developed a concept of romantic bureaucrat. Romantic bureaucrat is a bureaucrat of non-existent political order, romantically imagined political order. And also curators are such romantic bureaucrats because they serve a political order that actually doesn't exist, that only imagined order. And they recreate this order also only temporarily, yeah? So you create this documenta, and biennale, and this and that, and in a flash, in a moment, yeah, you have a feeling that yes, yeah, the international exists, yes, yeah, that's it, yeah. But next moment you understand everything is solved, yeah. So it's a kind of internationalism in a flash, yeah, in a moment, yeah. Temporary emergence of something that is actually absent.
It's interesting because in one of your recent articles for eFlux, between the archive and the Gesamtkunstwerk, you talk about the kind of change in the role of the museum, which sounds similar to what the way you're describing the curator, whereby the museum used to be the place that would stop the flow of time, and now the museum stages the flow of time. And so is there a difference between the institution and the curator in this way of operating, or do you think that they've become kind of one of the same thing, as in the curator works in the institution to stage the flow of?
I think there are some parallel developments. First of all, museums, traditional museums, lost their dominance and lost their defining power and the hegemonic position. Already, they began to lose very early, already in the 70s and 80s. And I was very skeptical about institutional critique because I always believed that this institution collapsed, yeah, without any critique in the next moment, yeah. And that is precisely what they did. For a very long time, general public believes that the museum defines something, yeah, and dictates a taste, I don't know what, make a decision. But actually, nobody believes it now. Everybody believes that Sotheby's Christie's and Art Friend Basel do that. And museums are poor relatives, yeah, they cannot compete. So forget about that. And at the moment, the economical power, institutional power of museum as an institution collapse. At the same time, people, I mean population in general, is not interested in vita contemplativa. Yeah, people are not interested in contemplation as form of life. Yeah. We are living, at least since Goethe Faust, yeah, in vita activa. And so a museum reflects, a museum reacts to this first of all, loss of institutional power, and secondly, loss of power to be archives of memory, because the function to be archives of memory is now Google and internet. Yeah. So Google substituted actually the museums in a very effective way, in a very efficient way. For example, if MoMA, I don't know, Metropolitan Museum can put and display only 78% of the collections, they can put the collections on the internet and it's seen by everybody. So it's really quite a change. And under these conditions, museums begin to be interesting and interested in activity. Yeah? Temporary exhibitions, screenings, lectures, meetings, symposiums, reading, music, concert, and so on. So museum begins to be something like a place of public activity of different kind, instead of being a place of contemplation. And almost everything that museum does is a blog. Yeah? If you want to know what happens, yeah, you are interested not what is to see in the moment. You are interested what happens in the moment, and so you go to the website of MoMA and you follow what happens there. That is how we use museum system in contemporary world, I would say.
So, following that, in 1998, Manifesta 2 happened. I thought it was interesting to look back at a manifesto as we have one on our doorstep right now. It was held in Luxembourg, and there was a curator and critic called Robert Fleck, who wrote an article called After Communism. And in this article, he suggests that there is a new international style that comes out in the 1990s by artists. And this was a kind of another moment. If you like, there's the issue of Kabakov and generations who have kind of risen to fame in the 80s, and what happens to them when they're showing all over the world in the 1990s. And then there's these artists that I'm thinking about that have come of age in the 1990s. And what Fleck suggests is that basically after the 80s there's a return by artists in the 1990s to putting criticism at the heart of art practice, and saying that art practice can be a stage or a place for criticism. And so therefore, but rather than being a more kind of universalist intellectual, he talks in the Foucauldian term of being a specific intellectual, and that artists suddenly in the 1990s are able to be very specific in their criticism of something that they are interested in, that relates to them, but not universalizing what criticism is. So some of the artists that I've selected for the exhibition are people like Felix González Torres, Shirin Neshat, Erwin Group from Ljubljana, who are all people who deal with this, with very much kind of saying, I'm not going to speak universally about what's happening, but I am going to merge aesthetics and kind of criticism of what's going on in the world together to try and come up with a new way of presenting to audiences what's happening. So I wonder, kind of following your way of thinking about how museums are working, to bring it back to artists, do you think it is possible to define the fact that there are a new generation of artists? Do you see it like that, that there's suddenly a way in which art practice can be something different?
Yes, I do, but I think that there is a kind of division inside the art world. There are many divisions here. But there's at least one division that is relevant for this question. It is the division between artists working for the commercial luxury production, let's say, so for the market, for the art market. And then you have a certain kind of diversity, simply because, I don't know, in every other branch, you need different kind of preference and different kind of shoes, whatever. So you have a certain kind of diversity. But it's interesting that precisely in an artistic field, when, in which the artists try to shift themselves from the object production to event, that could be also production itself as an event, but also long-term projects, performances, involvements on all possible, political and social, and so on and so on. So we have a huge range of activities. All these activities are presented as documentation. And stylistically, aesthetically, every documentation is like every other documentation. So you go through the spaces and you see one documentation from the artist from Peru. There's a video, photographs, text, explication. And then from Malaysia and so on. The problems are different, the artists are different, but the documentation is the same. And also, if you invite an artist, a young artist specifically, what he delivers mostly is a PowerPoint presentation, that is not very far from commercial or corporate PowerPoint presentation. And I also said that today at the museum school that I do exams here. I do exams in New York and other places. And to make an exam here, to the artists, you are invited, at least in NYU and Columbia, but you are invited to the studio of the artist. So artist doesn't come to you, you come to the artist. And so you come to the artist, and my experience is always the same. You come to the artist, is a place with one table, two chairs, with laptop, and then the artist shows his activities and participation. So actually, what he shows to you is not a production of this first traditional sense, but a kind of CV, yeah, the history of his own life as participation in different projects. And that experience, of course, show to what degree the medium of artistic activities shifted. Yeah, from traditional medium, I speak not the new medium, old medium. I speak from the production / reproduction to event / documentation. And these two couples are opposing in many ways. Yeah, they're different. The structure also visual field in different ways.
It's interesting because one of the projects in the New International is to represent the 1992 NSK embassy that happened in Moscow that the Irwin Group did. It took place from the 10th of May to the 10th of June in 1992. And Boris, I know that you know the Irwin Group very well. It's been interesting. To me, it was very important to include a project like this that has no evidence apart from documentation. But the question is what to do with that, because basically the first project was started by this organisation called Apt Art International, that I'm sure many of you know about, which Victor Messiano was behind with a couple of other people. And basically Irwin applied to an open call to come and work in the kind of style of apartment art in Moscow. And they proposed to make a series of conversations and discussions around what it is when the East meets the East. And it was one of the very first times that these conversations were had with artists from other parts of Eastern Europe in Moscow. And so the thinking is, well, how do you present that now? How do you give people access to the fact that it's important to know what happened then? But then how do you, or should you, update it? So again, I know you've had a great deal of experience, one in talking to them, but also in thinking through these issues. So in terms of thinking through a project like that and updating it, I just wonder what your opinion is in terms of how you introduce newer generations into that kind of conversation.
Well, I think that this NSK experience was interesting for me also because outside of Russia, in the East, including actually also China, not only European East, communism is seen and perceived as synonym for Russian imperialism and foreign domination. So everything that is created at that time is not included in one's own history, is one's own cultural identity. So everything seems to be kind of external occupational phenomenon. The only exception for that, maybe the only exception indeed, is Yugoslavia, yeah, because Yugoslavian communism was became very different from Stalin's at the very early stage. So they have an experience of something like indigenous communism, yeah. And so it's, for me, always a pleasure to speak to my Yugoslavian friends, because they always try to include, to take seriously the communist experience, and to include it in the work, yeah, and to reflect on them. What one cannot find in any other country, yeah, simply because it's rejected completely. But of course, the experience of Yugoslavian communism was different in many ways. But in one way, especially, Tito organized this, movement from non-aligned countries, yeah, between the West and the East, yeah. It was a very popular project, actually, in Yugoslavia, together with Nehru, yeah, and with Indonesia, and so on and so on. So, Yugoslavian artists developed their own brand of internationalism, yeah, so non-aligned, mentality. And so you suddenly begin to realize there are different internationalisms. Yeah? There's something like American internationalism, there's something like Soviet internationalism, which is also internationalism, with communist parties all around the world, and very powerful ones, in France or Italy. You have Yugoslavian version of internationalism with non-aligned movements also all around the world. And if you go to China, you develop understanding of another internationalism. So you have not only one internationalism, you have many internationalism competing and combining. And I think that is the background for these discussions. Yeah.
So the word new, again, Boris has written much on the new. And it's a word that I used in the title because in the 1990s, again, Robert Fleck talks about a new international style. Innova, the Institute for International Visual Arts in London, staged a conference called Global Visions towards a new internationalism in 1994. So in the 90s, this word new was all the rage. Everything was new again. And Boris, I know that you've written a book on the word new. I haven't read the book, but I have read the essay that is in the Art and Power. So I wonder if you can, has the word new run out of newness, or is it, because I'm just interested in, I'm still uncomfortable with knowing what the word new in the title of the New International really kind of does. So.
Well, I like the title. The point of the book was polemics, different directions. One of them, so one of the line of polemic, was against the idea there is something new in technology. And I don't believe that there is something new in technology. Technology is never new, it's always only better. Yes, for example, you have an old iPhone, you exchange that for a new iPhone, but this new iPhone is better iPhone. Yeah, so it's promised that it is better. Yeah. But if you look, for example, at the development of art, you see two differences. First of all, new things are worse. For example, I don't know, Littleton makes a plane Littleton that doesn't fly. So it's actually worth as an actual plane. That's point number one. And point number two, it doesn't substitute the old. So the substitution doesn't happen. You have a kind of archive, kind of narrative. You have the real airplane, you have the image of airplane, you have the Tatlin, yeah. So it stays in a kind of history, yeah, as a moment in history. It doesn't replace the old. And only because it doesn't replace the old, it is new. Yeah, what replaces the old is not new, it's only better. Only what doesn't replace old is new, because you can't compare. So, new internationalism or new international can be only new if, as you did it in fact, now in our conversation, we put this new internationalism in a kind of narrative about old internationalisms of different kind. So the Marxist international, Trotskyist internationalism, and Titoist internationalism, this internationalism, that internationalism, and maybe Guy Debord's internationalism or whatever. And now you have new internationalism. This new internationalism doesn't substitute all this old international, but adds to this story a new chapter. So in this sense, it seems to me, okay, thank you.
Good. So one more question, the missing link, and then we'll open up for questions. But you've done a lot of work around and with materials from Alexander Kojève.
Yeah.
and I'm sure many of you know what Boris has been writing in relation to Kojève and the exhibitions that he's been doing. But what I think is interesting about him in this conversation is that he stands for a kind of post-history and a way of, well, first of all, the way that he works is that he was responsible for developing, a branch of the European Union. And so he represents a kind of internationalism that is about one world, the kind of post-Second World War way of thinking about how nations could cooperate. Then the exhibition that you have developed, which shows his photographs in relation to the postcards, is very much a kind of one world. It's he travels the world and he takes photographs that are actually quite generic or post anything. They don't have any kind of resonance of a particular moment, I don't think. So can you slip Kojève into this version of, like, how does he relate to a kind of thinking through what international means?
He was in many ways an interesting figure, and as you know, he decided to leave the abandoned philosophy after the World War II, and was co-founder, if not founder, of EU. And now he became suddenly very popular in the USA, because in the USA everybody asks herself, what is EU? Yeah. And so rereading Kojève is a kind of must here now, suddenly became a must. But what's interesting about Kojève is that he started to deal seriously with this figure is that he produced during his career as a high functionary EU 5,000 photographs. It's a lot, and very beautiful photographs in fact, and also collected 10,000 postcards. And he was kind of Hegelian in a way, in which maybe Warhol was, because he decided to submit his individual gaze to a collective gaze. He never made a photography before, so as he decided to make photography, he started postcards to adapt his individual gaze to the collective, neutral, global gaze, non-subjective perspective, some kind of combination between popular gaze and divine gaze. It's very interesting and it's very clear. You can find in the library, in the Parisian library. Actually, it's a mystery why nobody was interested in this archive. As I asked people in Parisian library to show me, the first answer was this collection never existed. It doesn't exist now. So it was quite a work on my part to persuade people that it really exists. So beyond that, there is a closed part of it, so kind of secret part of it. It's an erotic photography. It's a cabinet for erotic photography. And it's very interesting how he produced it. He made a collection of cutting from French newspaper with nudes, and then he invited models and asked them to take the same positions and photograph them from the same distance. So he tried to understand what is a public eroticism, what's interesting about this nudes, why people buy it, and why they look at it, and why they look at it in this way. So he kind of repeated or reenacted the initial act of photography to reconstruct the way at which people came to this image. It is a very Hegelian procedure, it's how Hegel actually operates. And if you follow this archive, this 5,000 beautiful photographs all around the world, you see also regional differences, and you see that he was fascinated only actually at that time by one event. It was Cultural Revolution in China. It's only one moment where he's really interested in inner contemporaneity, yeah? And he made a series of photographs of cultural revolution. And as I have shown this archive in China, the part of this archive in China, Chinese were fascinated because of almost no documentation from that time on this level. Otherwise, it is a world not only after history but after humanity. The humans disappear. Everything is depopulated, and you see only landscapes or urban space.
How does the word universalizing fit into that? I'm very confused about that, because in a way, you know, the thing that we haven't kind of put into the middle of this is that there is in order to be international, there has to be some way of being able to communicate between different people, different places, different ideas. But the way that I understand it is that some people, Kabakov, for example, or it sounds like Kojev, kind of go for something that is about thinking of mankind as one. And then there's a way in which other artists think about the specificities or the context specificity of a situation. Is that right? Is there a way in which Kojev shifts the way that we can think about universalizing or not?
I would say that among many other ways, yeah, to speak about universalization, which is not the same as internationalism, I would suggest it's kind of similar but not the same. There are at least two ways. Yeah, one way is to become universal. Yeah, so that is way chosen by Malevich, for example. Yeah, he wants to create universal image, and that's a black square. Yeah? So it's not about being interested in any images, yeah, all around the world, because every image has a structure of black squares, so it's an image with a frame. Yeah? And so he creates a universal image that is universal in a certain way. What Kojev tried to do is also to become universal, but to become universal through the universality of camera, not as a painter and artist, but to become a camera, to look at the world in a neutral way, to not to be subjective anymore, or to become as neutrally subjective as camera is. Yeah? And that is also another way to speak about universalism, is to becoming universal, yeah? To becoming a camera. But you can also understand universal as universal communication. Yeah? In that case, you don't produce anything universal. You can produce whatever, as far as you are able to communicate with other people. So we can understand universalism and universal communication or flow of information. We can understand as becoming universal. Yeah? I think it's not the same thing. It's divergent practices.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience for any questions. Just one there.
У меня вопрос как раз в связи с International.
So you had an article, city in the period of its touristic reproduction, as opposed to old city, which keeps its identity. The new city is is having the circulation period, and we can see it all over the world. And the same happens to cultural identity elements, the same cuisine, the same design. All these cultural signs can be found in different places. But at your lecture on Monday, you said that artists and those people that find themselves in the global world, they prefer to keep their cultural identity. For example, Americans living in Germany want to preserve their cultural identity. They want to feel themselves as German. So how do you perceive this cultural phenomenon within national boundaries? Or is this cultural approach is not right? We should speak about just global field. I should say that when I emigrated,
some people don't understand. Okay. Yes, okay. Okay. So, когда я приехал на Запад,
so when I immigrated to the West, people started to ask me, "Oh, you're a typical representative of Russian people, of all Russian. So can you tell us about what it's like?" And the first thing I felt awkward. I didn't feel comfortable. I would say, no, I'm not typical. Well, probably there are people that know better. And I don't really know. So maybe I was more inclined to universal things. And the public that listened to me looked at me with a pity, and only one Dutch artist, Dutch lady, said something. I was having a talk in Amsterdam, and that Dutch lady said, "Oh, now I understand you. You are a typical Russian who wants to be typically universal." So this typical feature and this typical Russian character was restored, and this was a lesson for me. You can see yourself any way you want. You can see yourself as a universal character or whatever you want, but other people see you differently. They see you through their own eyes, so they see you as a Russian who is trying to be universal. And that's how it finishes. There is such a thing as somebody else's perspective, somebody else's view, and you can't do anything about it. You can give as many arguments as you want, but nothing would work. I'm interested in the topic and in this exhibition. Can you hear me? So, during the 35th minute you got down to the topic, then you moved away. I was trying to think about what the talk was about. So I want to ask whether I understood it right or wrong. First of all, the curatorial practices, whatever it is a form of globalized life of art and art operation. Then globalization is not possible in today's world, and curators are full of illusions. Well, it's quite right. This is what I actually said. If we give a short summary, well, you can feel as critical or apologetic. I take it as apologetic. Well, speaking about art, it's a world of illusions. And art is about creating illusions. So these illusions have many stories. The artist gives his own illusions. The curator gives their own illusions. The spectators have their own illusions. So it's a multi-layered cake that consists of different kinds of illusions. If we take a look at the reality, I can say that there's the same complex of illusions, maybe less interesting. Art is more interesting range of illusions as compared to everyday life, what we find in reality. And there are no other differences. During your lecture, you said that curator came at the forefront. Do you have any concerns with regard that curator can just overshadow the artist? I don't think so. The main problem here is that the curator uses an artist's work for his curatorial project, but he uses those works only temporarily, for some time, and then the other curator can use the same works for some other period of time, and the third curator can use the works for the next period of time, and that's the way that help the works reveal themselves. It shows that those works can be interpreted in many ways, and that's a good thing for artists' works. That's my first consideration. Then the second consideration, there's nothing that prevents the artist from becoming a curator. The artist can organize the exhibitions as installations, just like Ilya Kabakov's did. If the artist wants it, they can organize their works as exhibitions, as installation. It might be a challenge for the artist and the problem, but it's not bad. Just the artist should be stimulated to do this. You mentioned Manifesta 1, and since we, like Kate said, that the next Manifesta is at our doorstep, so I'd love to ask, in the context of today's Manifesta, many people were outraged by clear curatorial concept. How has curatorial work or practices changed over the last 20 years? Well, I haven't really seen that exhibition. I don't have my own opinion. I saw some other exhibitions, but not this one. But if we take a look at the whole range of curatorial works, they're very different. There's no some standard approach to curatorial work. Some curators have a very pragmatic approach. Some other curators are more spontaneous, are more keen on just demonstrating their tastes and their love to some artists. Some curators want to create some special effect based on contrast. Some others try to identify some unity or commonality. So there are as many strategies as there are curators. Some try to show mainstream, some others deviant practices. So the strategies are completely different. And of course we can criticize them, but it's just about pluralism among curators. I have two small questions. The first one is, if we speak about illusory character of art, maybe this thought is illusory itself. And the second question is, how do you foresee the death of curatorial work as an institution? Well, we can foresee whatever we want, but it's difficult. Well, we saw the film Melancholia by Lars von Trier, and of course all the curators will die if it happens, unless they give themselves to that meteor. But we can't get rid of curators. Well, we can imagine the death of everything, including curators, but it's not anywhere near. As to illusions, we are all surrounded by illusions. Some illusions are pragmatically effective, that are persistent. For example, Malevich had an illusion that he created this black square as an icon of a new civilization. That was an illusion, no doubt. but it made its way, because wherever you go, you see people that think the same, that share the same illusion. And we know what the reality is. It's the illusion shared by many people. So if many people shared the Malevich illusion, it became a reality, and it happens every now and then. And the same is true about globalism and internationalism. If many people live within this illusion, it's true. So an individual illusion is a reality then, right? Well, the individual illusion is understood as madness, but if it spreads, then it becomes real. I have a question for both speakers. So the question for Boris Groys, you mentioned, you were talking about curatorial work. What projects do you consider successful or unsuccessful? And I mean curatorial projects. What projects did you like or you didn't like? Well, what I don't like is to judge, to make judgments and evaluations, because I'm in no position to do this. I always cry when I even have to assess my students' work. I usually give the highest mark, and I can't do this with regard to curatorial works. I like everything. I know it's maybe a crazy state, but whatever I see is good. Like you know the story about Gorky. I heard people saying that he would cry at the end of his life whenever he read any kind of text. And why are you crying? People would ask him, and he would say, "Oh, he was crying because he was touched very deeply, just because somebody is writing." So that's true about me. Whenever I see some cultural activities, some art activities, I begin to cry. And my question for Kate Fowle. You mentioned the new international project. Are you going to show Ilya Kabakov? Are you going to have some artists from Ukraine? This is a question for Kate. Kate.
So there are 10 different projects in the New International, and they're all artists who, it's people like Felix Gonzalez-Torres, Shirin Nishat, Erwin Wu, Santiago Sierra, Alexander Brenner, and then in the younger generation there's Goshka Makuga, Jan Vo. So there's nobody from the Ukraine, but it's looking very much at people who are kind of fairly well known in art now, who are younger, who are in their 40s, but who have a very very strong perspective on how to say something that is about kind of being international in different ways. So it's a very small exhibition insofar as it has 10 different projects, but it's trying to look kind of more in depth at the ideas behind each of the works.
So you are, as a curator, do you think it's important to show the sentiment that you're trying to show, to present? So is there some universal thing, or do you welcome just specific responses from the audience for you as a curator?
I welcome specific responses. In fact, it's a pleasure to hear when people actually respond themselves, rather than it being a kind of generalized idea about the exhibition. And one of the things that I've been interested in with developing this exhibition is to try and be specific, because this word international is it kind of moves around a lot, and it has different, so it's trying to, as a starting point for more work in the future, for more thinking with artists about this topic. It's trying to be as specific as possible, but from different perspectives. So the audience can come and see different versions of how artists, as a result of the 1990s, how they've been able to talk about what it is to be in the world from more than one perspective at any one time. So apparently we have time for one more question, so it's yours.
I've been very lucky, thank you. My question is related to post-globalism. Is this a reality or illusion? Okay, it's clear. The example with iPhone, it's clear. The new internationalism, it works, it's clear. But when does globalism become post-globalism? Is it not an illusion?
It's interesting because for me it's very important to, I don't know if we're post-history, I suppose we can be post-anything. But in terms of, I'm very interested in separating the word international out from the word global, because I think that as Boris was explaining earlier in his kind of thinking today, international can relate to ways of thinking through what's happening in the world culturally, whereas globalization and global and post-global is that I'm not confident about how to use any of those words in a meaningful way in relation to art practice or how I as a curator or people I know who are writing are trying to deal with issues that are being made into art right now. I don't understand how to use global or post-global. Okay, see, this is cheating. Now there's one more question.
Let's continue our funny conversation about illusions. So let's say somebody has some individual illusion or a group illusion, but he doesn't say about anyone, and then he just uses it, some psychologist, and it becomes very effective. Well, I can only tell you about my practice. If somebody has an illusion, he opens a website and describes his illusion on the website. Then either people visit that website or not. We live in a fragmented world. And there are many things that are taken from different places. For example, when I lived in Germany, I was impressed to see that there are many websites for man-eaters, when people suggest themselves to be eaten and some others are willing to eat those. So there are completely different types of practices and activities, and they are all presented globally. And like Nietzsche used to write about his Zoroaster, the internet is a book for everyone and for no one. So that's my answer to your question. What we do is for everyone and for no one. And it's true about any cultural practice, especially today.
So Boris, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to have a conversation tonight. It's been a complete pleasure for me, and I think the audience by their faces have enjoyed it. So please join me in thanking Boris.